Hi everyone, welcome to the second part of Lennie's tutorial. The first part obviously was the drawing of Lennie's eyes in dry colour pencil. For the second part, I've broken it down into three parts. So the eyes, now this second part is going to be showing how I lay down the base layer of the watercolour pigment and up to the point where we will be adding water at the end. And then the third part of the video to come later will be where I work over the top of this underpainting using just dry pencil. So here we, again, it's going to be a mix of real-time and time-lapse drawing where I've just speed up slightly once you've got an idea of what I'm doing. But to start off here, just want to explain with Lennie, his fur, I've simplified the process of the creation of this one for you, broken it down so the black fur itself, very different to the black spaniel, we're using much less of a palette range, so we're only using say 4 or 5 pencils to create all of the black fur. So first of all, line drawing down, I'm following and starting to, I'll call it colour blocking even though I'm just using black pencil here at the moment. I'm just filling in the darkest shapes and areas, working left to right because I'm right-handed, and I've got my glassine paper under my hand, and this will prevent any smudging, any movement of pigment, any sort of dirtying up of any of my areas that I want to keep clean. So keep that glassine paper under your hand at all times, and I'm starting off here just adding in the black, the darkest areas first. And rather than using a normal Albrecht Dürer pencil, I've chosen to use the Magnus, which is just exactly the same, but it's the chunkier version of the pencil. It just means I can get a little bit more pigment down. I don't have to sharpen my pencil quite as much. So working left to right, I'm just using, again, do your pressure test before you start this off. Do your pressure test, mix some of your pencils together that you're going to be using, layer them up, add more pressure in some areas, and then add your water and allow it to dry, and then you'll get a bit of an understanding of how much pigment or how little pigment you need in an area to create what level of tonal value. So here, like I say, I'm just using the black and following the lines, keeping an eye on my reference photo, flicking my eyes back and forth. Every time you see me pause, it's where I'm looking at my reference going, is that in quite the right place? And I'm going in with a pressure 3 to 4 to start with, just to get something down. I want to get a layer of pigment down all over, and then I'll start to intensify it in certain areas. So I've gone in here now with a warm grey 3. I'll just double check that though, and it'll be in the list of materials. And where I've got some lines on that ear, just little outlines of the fur on the ear and the shape, so just mark those in. You see, I feel my way very much like over the eyes. I feel my way with these first layers of pigment until I get into the flow, and I'm happy with the placement of the lines. Yes, I've got my line drawing there, but you know, sort of I'm looking back at that reference, and we're filling in now, sort of like blocking in the shapes and the contours and the contrast. So like I say, I've simplified this, so we'll be using a lot of the black, a couple of greys, an indigo, white, and probably a touch of the Prussian blue, only a couple of little touches. I also know that we do pop a tiny bit of ochre into some of the fur as well along the ear later on. So just flicking between the black and the grey, same light to medium pressure, just feeling our way. This is real time at the moment. I think this took just under 2 hours, maybe 1 hour and 40 minutes to get the whole amount of pigment down and the water added. Obviously I edit out any time that I stop to sharpen my pencils, etc. So that's just pure sitting at the drawing board and putting down pigment and working. So again, those lines just across the top of the head there, starting to mark those in with that grey pencil. Just marking in the edge of that eye and that cheek. It just pops forward a tiny bit when we add the water, and it pops forward over that ear. If you look at the angle of the light for Lennie, it's beautifully lit. So the light is coming in sort of from the front right hand side. So the left ear, as we look at it, is in almost in complete darkness under there. So a tiny bit of artistic license using the greys and a little bit of white later on, just to emphasize that there are some shapes in there and we don't make it one flat layer of black. And again, this is why as well, you could, if you wanted to, just use your blacks, greys and whites. But I find, I don't know, it's just a personal choice. I just find that as soon as you start injecting some colour into it, so some indigos or some violets or even some greens, that's when you start to get beautiful, beautiful, rich black fur with more depth and more shine and more true to what fur is like in reality. So again, one tip I always give is if you see any dogs out there, any cats, any animals that you can get hands on, go and feel their fur and go and look at their fur. Look at it in the sunshine. Some of the dogs, if they're outdoor dogs or they're older, they spend a lot of time out in the sun, they'll have lovely reddish violet hues through their fur, especially if it's longer fur. Older dogs, obviously, they grey and, you know, certain areas over time. But you'll also have spaniels and other types of dogs where they have beautiful bluey black richness going through. Obviously take into account as well with the portrait, the surroundings. So with Lennie here, he's lying on a really bright white leather sofa, so there's a lot of reflection up. He's very much, you know, lit from underneath as well. But I did have other reference photos to work from with Lennie. I was very lucky, so I could flick, you know, back to those as well. So obviously I've gone in and I've laid down my initial black pigment with a medium to light pressure, got the placement right, and now I'm happy that placement's right. I'm going back in and adding another layer. And you can see on the ear I've used a bit more pressure, so I've pushed a bit more pigment on there. Now the difference between putting more or less pigment down is obviously when you add water, is how intense that pigment will become when it's become wet and then dry. But also when working on a sanded paper like pastel matte or your UArt, it means that the more pigment you've added and the more water that you add to that pigment, the more it sinks into the tooth of your paper. And again, like I said, this comes with experience. The more confidence you've got to add more pigment at this stage, it means less dry layers later on, so less hard work later on. I would prefer it at this point, if you're not feeling 100% confident in going in with a lot of pressure and adding in too much pigment, is to just put in a lighter layer and then do more work on the dry layers later on. Less is more. Is my motto. But if you are feeling confident enough, go in with a little bit more pressure. I don't think you can really put down too much pigment as long as you've got good placement and it's broken up with colour and your lights and darks. As long as it's all in the right places, it just means, like I say, more intensity and more pigment in that tooth. Less layers later on, less hard work later on. But it just comes with time and practice of using this technique. So again, going in here, you can see here still, my pressure's not super hard. See where I'm holding my pencil? I'm holding my pencil between a third and a halfway up. So that means that, you know, the pressure's not super heavy. You'll see me later on working with a white or a grey, and I'm holding it halfway up. So you know the pressure can't be that much. It's just the fact that the tooth of the paper, once you rub the pencil over it, it just grips onto it really, really well. Watercolour pencils and pastel mat, like I say, that's why they work so well together, or any sanded surface. Just grips it so beautifully. So again here, you see me pausing, looking at my reference photo, just feeling my way, marking in around those lines, making sure we're getting the dark pencil on the right side of the line, not as in the right hand side of the line, but the correct side of the line that are in place. The slightest mark, if I put that black line the wrong side of my, you know, whatever line is down there from my line drawing, it makes all the difference. I suddenly narrow Lennie's face, make his eye sort of like, you know, look too big, make his ear too wide. So it is all about keeping your eye on that reference photo. And again, you know, sort of, yes, I provide a line drawing. If you prefer to make your own line drawing or just work straight from the photo itself and transfer from the photo, it's that way, it's your lines that are going down, it's your impression that's going down onto your support, rather than you trying to work from mine and second guessing, what did she mean by putting that line down there? What exactly, you know, is she highlighting there or drawing around? But as I say, it's quite, you know, sort of, it's quite a simple one to follow, Lennie. Unlike a lot of dogs, Lennie, being a King Charles Cavalier, is more of a flat face breed. Not a true flat face like a boxer, but his nose is more squashed up, so the muzzle isn't long and protruding like, say, a collie or a German Shepherd. And also with this breed, it's not the nicest descriptive word, but his head is more bulbous, so it's much more rounded. So where the nose is squashed up a little, and also these are bred, their craniums, their actual skull is more squashed and rounded. So also then it means the eyes seem a little bit more deep set and bulbous as well. And rather than being a long contour over the forehead, it means it doesn't, he definitely has a real set brow line, really rounded across the top of the head, which we'll see now. I'm going in now with a white pencil, just going over the top of some of those light grey marks that were in there before. It just means that when I add the water, it becomes a slightly lighter version of that grey. I'll explain that as well, the theory behind, well, this is my theory, it's all my theory. Might not be correct, but it works for me. How I look at it is that, yes, you could create this underpainting by using paint. So if you wanted to, you could just use watercolour paint, or you could use acrylics as your base layer as for your underpainting. Now for me, if I used watercolour paint, I would just get in a muddy mess and it would all mix together on my support, and I probably would give up drawing. But by using the pencils, you get to select exactly where you want your pigment placed. And where you mix the colours in, say, watercolour or acrylic, you would use a palette. So say you wanted a warm, light version of a deep ochre. With your paints, you'll put in like your most matching colour, which would be, say, a burnt ochre. And you might add to that a tiny touch of a brown shade or a deepish red shade. And then to soften it, you would add maybe a warm greyish paint as well in there, a light warm grey. And then you'd mix the three together and you'd get yourself a nice warm ochre with a hint of reddish tone in there. And then you'd use that as a paint. What we do with the pencils is we use the support as our palette. So we would lay down our main colour, which we'd say, like when we get down to the tans, we'd put down a burnt ochre, and then we would put a touch of the Morton Violet pencil in around the areas that we want it, and then we'd lay either a cream or a warm grey over the top, and then when we add the water, the three mix together on the support like it would do as paint in a palette. And that's my theory behind it, the easiest way to explain it. So you see here, I've sped up a little bit now. We are repeating, we've placed in our black, we've gone in and highlighted our white, and now the areas between the white and the black are just softened back between the two, blend between the two, using a grey. Carrying on now, you just placing in, drawing in the shapes, following the lines, using the black pencil again. You understand the theory that we worked on from the left hand side. It's just exactly the same all over now. Lightly fill in, and then we can go back in and increase the intensity 2 or 3 times in the areas that we want super dark. So again, get in the shadows, draw up around those curl lines. Over here we'll have a few little shapes that we just want to shape in there, colour block in, or we should call it tonal blocking in, I guess, just using black, whites and greys. But we will go over all of this later on as well with a dark indigo. So we've got all the black in place on the ear. We're just going to come up and repeat the same up over the top and rotate between that and our white pencil. If you want to mark in all the black first or all the white first, you can. There's no rule behind that. I've just broken it down like this as I work. It's just a really good way, this, because colour pencils are such a slow medium to use. And I find that people have said with these, using this underpainting process, that they find it's really good because within a couple of hours you can have your image down. You can have a beautiful underpainted image down, and it almost like gives you sort of that spurt, that urge to go, right, oh, I've got all that done today, great, I can start on the, the colour block and dry layers. And yes, the dry layers do take a lot longer, and it's basically pretty much following traditional colour pencil methods, but this is just really great if you're a little bit stuck, a little bit like, oh, it's all taking me so long. This just helps you get something down. I don't use this method for that purpose. I really use this method because for me it's what helps give me beautiful depth and a glow of colour that shines through in the underpainting, as in the undercoat of the actual animal. So you see here, I'm still just rotating between my black and my white and my grey. I've softened back those highlights. I'll go in and I'll pick them out again. Same here, going in and picking out all those highlights along here using the white. And it makes it's quite crude just using the black and white, but we'll soften all this back with some grey and some of the indigo, and that way the black coming out into the bright highlight on the curl will soften and contour more naturally. Okay, so here we got the dark indigo now, and we also use some Prussian blue in there as well. And this is where we start to work over some of the black areas, but also over some of the light areas. It'll just blend the two together, and it'll just give it a beautiful, almost like a royal richness, I call it. So it's just that depth, like you would get in maybe like a deep, beautiful velvet fabric or something. But I say, go and look at any animals, especially black fur, whatever fur you struggle with. If it's white fur is never really white. Again, it picks up on all of the environment around it. So if a white animal is sat on grass, it's going to have the green reflected up into the fur. Maybe if it's a blue sky that day, there'll be some blue reflecting down. shadows. There will be aging in the fur. The elements will have affected it. So around the mouth, you get a lot of coloration, discoloration over time, where the mouth's often quite wet, and you get sort of quite the fleshy tones in there. So a light flesh, medium flesh. You get some ochres going through white fur as well. Same as in this fur, we'll get some reflection of the tan, the orangey colours in the face, coming through into the long black fur on the ear later on as well. So you can see here where I said earlier that, you know, we'd go over a lot of the black areas, but also all of these light areas. I'm going over it with the blue as well. And you can see how that's softening. And just remember, when we add the water, that's going to come out now as a beautiful, warm, light area with a beautiful richness of the blue, even across, see those bright highlights across there, because the super highlights will come later on when we create fur texture. Remember, this is just your base painting. These are your undertones. See past all of the fur texture, all of the detail when you do this. You're just plucking out the contrast and the colours that sit underneath all of the texture. It takes a practiced eye, and some of you get there quicker than others. There's no pressure, and you see here, just sped up again because you understand I've explained the process, and here just working over a lot of the black, not all of the black, but yeah, some of the black, a lot of the whites, softening it back. Just working over all those whites down over the ear as well. Wherever we've got the black going into the white, just softening it with the blue. Okay, just bringing some of the highlights back in again now. So we soften them back, and so we just go and brighten them up a tiny bit more. You'll find with doing this, we'll probably go in with the black again later on, just intensify some of those areas again. And it's just about building the layers. If, let's say, if this might take you 4 or 5 attempts at adding the layers, you know, lighter than I have. Just with experience, I've gone in there and I've managed to do mine in 2 or 3 attempts. You can also already see the shine and the depth and the colours coming through on that ear. Once more, just plucking out those real highlights. Squinting at the reference photo to see where are my brightest areas and my darkest areas. Just putting in little touches. So we'll go on now to our orangey areas, as I'll refer to them. So we'll start off with our burnt ochre. We'll just get some colour placement. We just want to fill in some of these areas, both brows and down around the muzzle and the cheek. Just popping in, like I said before, remember it's your palette. So we're going to pop in here some ochre. We'll pop in some violet. We'll probably use some ivory or cream in there as well. But when we add the water, it's all going to blend. So we'll put the texture in later. So again, this is, especially the brows, is a place where you really just want to get the colour in there and a rough idea of the tone and some of the richness of the reds. And you see here, as I mentioned earlier on, about that ochre being either reflected in some of that long black fur, or some of that long black fur has got some ochre running through it. And it was only something that I noticed when I got the ochre pencil out and started to add it in on the brows. All of a sudden, it made that ochre pop out on the ear then, of like, oh, there's a little bit there as well, or there's a little touch there. You'll find that you'll start putting a colour down, and that's what I call it, your pencil start dancing across the paper, because you'll put a penciled colour down and it's like, oh, that's up there as well. I didn't spot that before, and it's almost like you've suddenly made it pop out by popping the colour down somewhere else on the support. I suppose it's a bit like with makeup. They say, you know, sort of wear a certain colour eyeshadow or something, and it brings out the colour of your eyes. It's exactly the same with this, really. Sort of you pop down one colour and it complements and makes another colour pop out in front, you know, in front of you. So if you see something pop out, literally pop it, you know, go over and just add that colour or contrast in a little touch. So here, back to how I started off on that left ear, we're just feeling our way around here, looking at the reference image, popping in that ochre where we can see it. So now also down here we'll use a little bit of black around the bottom. There'll be a little bit of indigo going in there. We'll use some of our Morton Violet. And then we'll add in some, we'll do like we did up top, where we use the whites and greys on top of the black to soften and lift. With our browns, we'll use probably our ivory and cream, and then we'll use a light flesh as one of our light mixer colours, our highlights. So when we add the water, we get that lovely light pinky version of the ochres and reds, or a light creamy version. You don't really want to be adding white to your ochres and warm tones. Try and keep your warms and your cools and your warms separate, and that goes with not just the colours that you're putting down, but also the lightener and darkeners that you put in there. So here I'm just popping in a little bit of the sanguine, which is your brighter orange, just in places, just to give that brow a little bit of shape, a little bit of depth on both sides. Again, the full material list will go out with the complete downloadable tutorial. I know I do use a couple of the museum aquarels on here. I definitely know I use one. I know I used an ochre colour. I need to check the exact shade because I'm not au fait with the names of the museum aquarelle colours as yet, because they're quite, you know, I'm quite new to using those. Whereas the Faber-Castell range, I could walk down the road and probably name every pencil colour that is needed to create a branch of a tree, or definitely the ear of a dog or a cat. So here I've got the Morton Violet. Could put Morton Violet. Using that, it's quite a cool colour, but is especially on that left hand side where we're in shadow, using that to create my shadow. And I will use a little bit of blue in there as well. And I'll use this and a touch of black later on, just to mark in here the where the whisker follicles are. Again, when we add water down around the bottom here, this will all soften and blur a little bit. So again, look past the details, just look at the colours that are in that muzzle and the tonal values. So here I'm just wanting to pluck out a little bit of the grey highlights again and define around that nose, just make sure I'm not losing any of the shape. Last thing you want to do is start colouring in and taking the pencil over a line and taking it the wrong side of the line, and then you've got to sit and try and figure out sort of like, where did I go wrong, because we're not using a rubber or a razor on here. We're literally putting any mistakes that we make, we're correcting them with the next layer of pencil. Okay, so a dark shadow around underneath here. Seem to skip ahead there for some reason, but again we just marked in the black shadow areas of the nose, some of the white highlights up around the top of the nose, and some indigo and some Prussian blue in there as well. So you see there, I went in with the light flesh wanting to highlight in that area, but then I realised, thinking of it being the palette, that I needed to get the ochre colour in there first and then pop the flesh over the top. And now again back in onto those brows, just picking out some of the highlights and down around this side using my ivory, my cream down around that edge. So the ivory. And now that's really just adding in those touches, has really brought that muzzle, made it 3D. A little bit more light flesh in there. And again, this is the museum aquarelle that I've used. I just spotted there was one in there that was quite a nice cross between an ochre and a light flesh that would just work lovely in there. They do a lovely range of the browny tan shades, I find Caran d'Ache do. That's why I've switched to using some of the Pablos, and also now I'll start bringing in some of these museum aquarelles into my base painting, because they just have a lovely range that for some reason the Faber-Castell just seems to be missing. So a few little touches. I'm just going to go in now and just intensify. Before we add the water, I'm going to intensify some of the black areas. Like I said earlier, the more pigment I know I got in here, the less I'll have to build later on with dry layers, especially in the areas I know are definitely my darkest black. So next stage is going to be, we're going in to add our water. So I'll start this off again real time. Obviously being left-handed, right-handed, I'm working on the left-hand side. Now, what you need to remember is why we're adding the water. We're adding the water because we've just spent 2 hours putting down our pigment exactly where we want our pigment to be. We do not want to go in with our paintbrush and our water and start moving that pigment around. All we want to do is go in, add water to dissolve the wax that is binding our watercolour pigment together. That is all we are doing. If we start moving that brush from side to side or dragging those dark areas down into the light, we're moving the pigment around, we're destroying all that beautiful hard work of pigment placement that we've done with the pencils. And it defeats the object. You see here, I'm dragging the black down to where the grey and the white starts. I'll go in with a clean wet brush and work the lighter areas, and then the next, and then do the darker areas separately. So you literally just follow the lines, follow the shapes. So here, just sweep, and you see I'll just sweep over an area once, not twice, because if you do, you're lifting the pigment and dragging it back over again. So we'll go over the top, up around the highlights, and then we'll just see, we're just going to sweep up around there, down as far as the highlight area. And all we're doing is dissolving the wax. We're adding water, we're not painting, we're adding water. So lovely, see how when I add water there, you can see where we've mixed on our paper the blue and the white and the grey, especially over this highlight down over here. You can go back and forth, but you're not, only if it's the same colour or tonal value there, but you're only literally sweeping over an area once, making sure you've got enough water on there. See how wet that is for it to sink that pigment down into the tooth. The more pigment we've got down into that tooth, the less hard work we've got with the dry layers. So we've done that top bit, and now we'll just blend out into it that lighter strip, and then we would do the dark strip underneath. Just bring it around to this side, sweep it out into the ear, keep a lovely flow to it as well. You don't want to stop halfway through one of these curls. Let it start to dry and then go back in, because you'll get like a tide line that you've got to try and push through. You'll have like a break line part way through that looks awful. So here we go, we're going to do this next layer down. You can see here just how much of that pigment that we added in there, how intense that is looking. Again, I'm pausing because each time I'm looking at my reference photo. Always keep that reference photo there. So you get the idea. So I'm just speeding this up now, coming down here, following my lines, marking in my darks, marking in my lights separately. Beautiful dark area just down through there. Those blues are looking beautiful. You can see just where you've had a little touch, especially on that bottom, that ear where it's laying flat, where there was a little touch of blue and then a grey gone in over the top of the black. Add the water and it just pings forward. Like I say, this will soften. It won't dry quite as intense. But this, whilst it's wet, gives you a good idea of what the finished piece can look like as well. This is how much contrast that you need to get in with the dry pencils later on to create that depth. Don't be afraid. This is how dark you can take it. So when you're a bit later on, you're a bit scared of putting in those real darks I keep pushing you to put in. This is how dark you can take it, and look how beautiful it looks. So again, just sweeping around here, not really moving the pigment around, just dissolving that wax. I'll leave the nose and go up around the top, so this way it allows that area around the nose just to dry a tiny little bit. Sort of like, say, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, I'll come back down, and then it means that the nose won't all blur into the fur around it. It just gives it a little bit of a chance to dry a tiny bit. See how much water's going down on there. Okay, so coming to the end of this, the part 2. We leave this, very, very important, we leave this to dry overnight, at least overnight, because this paper, remember, is cork cellulose fibres sprayed onto a backing, and even though the surface might look dry or feel dry, underneath it might not be, and your pencils will just skid off the surface. So just make sure you let it dry thoroughly. Don't be impatient at this point, because you could just ruin all your hard work. Or just saying here, I said earlier on, you can go in with your pencils whilst it's still damp. So I'm going in here with my cream, and I'll go in with my little bit of sanguine, a little bit of ochre, and you can just intensify any areas where you want a bit more pigment. So that's the end of this part 2. Part 3 will see us working all the dry layers and bringing all the details to all of Lennie's beautiful fur. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned something. Thank you very much for watching.